Hello, this is Economic Competition, the role of the government, Section D, Government Budget Making Process. Our prioritized standard is Economic Standard 34. Objectively, we're going to distinguish between budget surplus and a budget deficit. Federal, state, and local government spending goes toward a large variety of spending priorities. The federal, state, and local governments have varying expenditure or spending priorities. Most federal spending goes toward Social Security benefits. You might want to remember what the top ones are on this. Hint, hint, wink, wink. National defense, Medicare benefits, Medicaid benefits, and also interest payments on the national debt. That's where most of our money goes. This is the largest one. You might want to remember that one. Most state and local spending goes toward healthcare expenses, education, public welfare, pensions, transportation, public safety. A couple other ones are going to be on the list too. It might be beneficial to remember the top one. You might want to know the top one. Hint, hint, wink, wink. The federal government, state and local governments also have varying sources of funding, including various types of taxes and also some borrowing. Most federal revenue comes from individual income taxes. That's the largest one. You probably want to remember the largest one. Payroll taxes, which pays for Social Security and Medicare. Borrowing, and corporate income taxes, among others, but those are the big ones. Most state and local revenue comes from sales tax. It's the biggest one in the great state of Tennessee. Property tax, which is big for us, not as big as some other states, though. Corporate income taxes, and individual income taxes. Great state of Tennessee, we don't actually have an individual income tax. But if you ever move to another state, there's a good chance they will, because a lot of them do. The federal budget is the federal government's plan for the use of government revenues during a fiscal year. Should point out a fiscal year. I did not say physical. I said fiscal with an F. Fiscal year for the federal government actually begins October 1st of every year. For the state government, our fiscal year basically means business year. Our state, Tennessee budget actually starts July the 1st. We're going to focus mostly on the federal government's budget making process, less so on the state, although the process is going to be very similar. The federal budget is developed by the President, which consults the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Department of the Treasury, and other presidential advisors. After the budget is completed, it is sent on to Congress for analyzing. After the budget is approved by both houses of Congress, it is returned to the President for signing. Now, I should point out, the budget that's actually approved by Congress will oftentimes have many changes from the budget that was originally submitted by the President. Now, if the changes are acceptable, the President may sign it, and therefore it makes it official. Now, if the changes are unacceptable, the President may actually veto the budget, which then sends it back to Congress. And then essentially this process will be in a repeating pattern until one of two things happens. Either Congress passes a budget that the President can live with and decides to sign and make official, or if Congress can muster up a 2/3 majority to override the President's veto, although that rarely happens when we're talking about the budget. Now, if the budget is not approved prior to the beginning of the new fiscal year, then the government actually shuts down until the President and Congress can actually agree on a budget. So if you ever went to D.C. and they had a government shutdown at the time, you would quickly realize that, you can't actually go and see any of the things you want to see because the federal government closed down. You can't do any of the things that actually belong to the federal government. Now, the government budget is balanced when its revenues equal its expenditures. So you have The government budget is balanced when its revenues equal its expenditures. So if the government has magically raised the exact amount of money that they have spent, they have balanced the budget. That's not usually what happens. More commonly, the federal government will have either a budget surplus or a budget deficit at the end of the fiscal year. Now, budget surplus. This is when government revenues exceed government expenditures, meaning they've brought in more money through taxes or other forms than they have actually spent. A budget deficit is when government expenditures exceed government revenues, meaning they are spending much more money than they are receiving through taxes and other forms. National debt. This is the total amount of money that the government owes, which is the accumulated annual budget deficits minus the annual budget surpluses. So something happens a lot in our government, that's called deficit spending. Now, this is the government policy of spending more money for its programs than it is able to cover with its tax revenues, which means this happens more frequently than this. Now, deficit spending has been relied upon due to things like national emergencies, aka wars, to provide public goods. People love their Social Security. If you didn't have the money for Social Security, that would not be good. So sometimes they have to spend money they don't have. And also to stimulate the economy during recessions. Recently, 2008 started their recession. At that time, the government had to really start spending money to try to kickstart the economy out of a recession. So because of those things, that's kind of why our national debt is so large and growing. Major problem that we are going to have with deficit spending is that the national debt has actually been growing at a very steep rate in recent years. So let me take you on a journey through our national debt that you might enjoy. So we had Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter spent what Jimmy Carter spent, and then Ronald Reagan became president, and Ronald Reagan showed Jimmy Carter how to spend money. How horrible. And then Baby Bush became president, and then Baby Bush taught Ronald Reagan how to spend money. And then Bill Clinton became president, and he didn't know how to play this game, apparently. He actually spent, by the time he left, there was extra money. He didn't actually spend enough money, so that's unfortunate. But then Baby Bush became president, and he showed all of them, hey, this is how you spend money. Let me show you how we spend money. And then Barack Obama became president. He said, oh, yeah, let me show you how to spend money. I'm going to spend money like it's never been spent before. So this has been a long-term problem by many different presidents. Just want to point out, if we want to see how this stands historically, well, our national debt is a percentage of our GDP, which is kind of a good way to determine where we are in our debt issue. Well, World War II was our highest point of spending. We had to spend a lot of money because we were at war. We are not really at that point, but as you see based on these projections, we are looking to be back at those World War II levels in the near future. So, yikes. All right. Now, there are things that can be done to limit deficit spending, but these options tend to not be very popular options among most Americans. Generally speaking, if politicians did these things, most of those politicians would fear of not being reelected. So generally speaking, the things you can do, people that can do it don't actually want to do it. All right, so Mr. Booth's running for president 2020. Focus on the future. My platform is I have a two-part plan to reduce the national debt. Part one, I'm going to increase revenues by raising taxes. I said that out loud. I just lost the entire Republican vote. Part two of my plan, decrease expenditures by cutting government spending. I just said that out loud. I just lost the Democratic vote. So as you see, this is why they are not actually serious about fixing the national debt issue. Because to actually do it right, you have to do both of these things, and neither side is willing to budge. So that's why our debt just continues to grow and grow and grow. Now, occasionally there are calls for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, but this has not received enough support since it would actually limit the government's ability to respond to recessions and actually maintain many programs. So, for instance, if you had a balanced budget amendment, that might actually force the government to cut spending on programs across the boards. So if we're talking about people that get Social Security, ouch, that would be very bad if you just had to cut people's Social Security benefits. Also, if there was a war and you had a balanced budget amendment, well, that would make it very difficult to fund a war because, hey, you have a balanced budget, you can't spend money you don't have. So again, that's another reason why we've never actually seen a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. All right, this concludes economic competition, the role of the government. Section D, government budget making process lecture. Our prioritized standard again was Economic Standards 34, and objectively now you can distinguish between a budget surplus and a budget deficit.